We've all come across a news article or an event described in the history books that seemingly has no explanation, despite massive amounts of research having been done to solve it. These types of cases have occurred throughout our history, and many years later, we're no closer to finding a satisfactory explanation. Number 10. Historians have been unable to find much information on a girl named Abigail Williams, who was one of the first people ever to be accused of witchcraft during the Salem witch trials that occurred between February of 1692 and May of 1693. What is certain, though, is that she was born in July of 1680 in Salem, Massachusetts, and she was living with Reverend Samuel Parris, her uncle, and his daughter, Betty. It's believed that her parents had passed away, and so she had no choice but to move in with their extended family. At the time, locals were obsessed with identifying witches, and unfortunately, a game that Abigail would play with a few of her friends would result in her being accused of being involved with the occult. The game in question was called the Venus Glass, and it involved dropping egg whites into a glass of water, after which the resulting shapes were read in an effort to learn more about the men that they would marry one day. It was just a bit of fun, but before long, the girls started believing they could see the future. And on one occasion, where the shape of a coffin appeared in the glass, they became terrified that one of them would lose their lives shortly. It was now the start of the year, 1692, and that's when Abigail's troubles began. She and Betty both started having seizures, suffering from unexplained aches and pains, and claiming that they were being hounded by spirits that would pinch them when no one was looking. It didn't take long before the other girls in the group also started suffering from these same afflictions, and a month later, they were examined by Dr. William Griggs. After determining that they were healthy as ever, he drew the only conclusion that made sense at the time, that they'd been bewitched somehow. Reverend Parris asked him to keep his opinion to himself, out of fears that the girls would be prosecuted if news got out, but unbeknownst to him, one of his congregation members, a woman named Mary Sibley, spoke to a man named John Indian and explained to him how he could find out who had cursed the girls. This involved using ashes to bake a cake made out of rye meal and feeding it to a dog, but it isn't known how this was meant to identify a suspect. Nevertheless, the girls came forward just a few days later to report that they'd been bewitched by 3 local women, Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne. At the word of the girls, the 3 women were arrested and put on trial. Tituba confessed to being a witch and assured everyone in attendance she was only one of many witches living among Salem. She also added that the town had been taken over by the devil and that he was responsible for the locals' obsession with witchcraft. In the weeks that followed, many more people were put on trial for witchcraft after being accused by Abigail and her friends, one of whom was John Proctor, who'd maintained that the group of girls was lying about being bewitched. When all was said and done, Abigail had pointed fingers at as many as 57 people, but she only testified against 8 of them. She's last mentioned in the town's records on the 3rd of June, 1692, when she attended a trial, and after which no one is certain what became of her. It's been suggested that she was sent to live elsewhere to get her away from the witch mania. She was responsible for at least 15 people losing their lives thanks to her accusations, but no one knows where she went or what became of her after leaving Salem for good. Number 9. Gaspar Corte Royale is a well-known explorer who was born in 1450 in the Azores Islands, specifically in an area called Angra do Heroísmo. His family was part of Portuguese nobility, and his father served as the governor of Terceira, and an explorer who passed his love for exploration to Gaspar. As a young man, Gaspar received the best possible education, as he was sent to live with the Duke of Beja, who served as his teacher. Whenever his father and older brother were unable to, Gaspar served as governor, but he would also join his father on some of his expeditions. After his father passed away in 1496, Gaspar traveled to Portugal, where he visited with King Manuel, and he became enamored with the idea of exploration. Upon finding out that an area had been discovered that might fall within Portugal's boundaries, the king sent Gaspar out into the world to find new areas to explore and to look for the Northwest Passage that would give them access to Asia. Gaspar was happy to oblige, and in 1500 he set sail from Lisbon and headed to Greenland, which he mistakenly believed to be Asia. Upon arriving, he and his crew sailed along Greenland's coast, but they were forced to turn back due to thick ice in the ocean. The following year, he set out on his second expedition, accompanied by 2 other ships. He decided to take a different route, and this time landed in what is now Labrador. There, he discovered wild berries and pine trees, and he took 60 natives as slaves. 5 months later, one of the ships arrived back in Lisbon with 7 of the slaves aboard, but there was no sign of Gaspar or the other ship. His brothers started to fear the worst, but 3 days later, the second ship arrived. But Gaspar was not aboard this ship, and his brothers were then informed that the vessels had become separated while out at sea, and that they each had to find their own way back. Almost exactly a year after Gaspar left Lisbon, his brother Miguel decided to set sail to look for him. He took 3 ships and made his way to Newfoundland, where he and his men observed a series of coves, islets, rivers, and harbors. He believed that Gaspar's ship might be hidden in the area, and ordered that the fleet split up to search for him. They agreed to meet back up on the 20th of August, but when the day came, only 2 of the ships arrived. Miguel's ship was unaccounted for, and despite searches being carried out, he was never found. But it's been suggested that Miguel lived in Newfoundland for about 9 years after arriving there, though this has never been confirmed. Gaspar was also never found, and his fate remains unknown. Number 8. The Chinese politician Lin Biao was born in the Hubei province of China in 1907, and he received his primary education at a local village school. Following this, he attended a school in Wuchang, starting there in 1921. At the time, China was in the midst of a social and cultural upheaval, and by all accounts, this had a profound impact on him. As a result, he developed an interest in politics, specifically communism and socialism. He joined China's Socialist Youth League in 1923, and 2 years later traveled to Canton, where he started studying at the Whampoa Academy. There, he joined the Chinese Communist Party, which was working with the Soviet Union and the nationalists against the country's warlords and imperialists. Thus, Biao was recruited by the Nationalist Army, and in 1926, he was part of the Northern Expedition that marched on the Yangtze River in an effort to overthrow the warlords. He proved himself as an excellent soldier, as he quickly rose through the ranks and became a battalion commander. But he was forced to flee, along with many of his fellow soldiers, when Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the expedition, suddenly switched sides in 1927. That same year, he took part in the Nanchang Uprising with his fellow communists, and soon became known as one of Mao Zedong's finest commanders. 5 years later, he attained the rank of Corps Commander, and by the age of 28, he'd become somewhat of a legendary figure since he'd never lost a single battle. He relocated to Shaanxi, where he became the president of the Red Army Academy. After World War II ended, he relocated to Manchuria and was made the commander of the 4th Field Army. He rallied people living in the countryside and slowly but surely gained the upper hand over his nationalist enemies. His army grew from 100,000 men to 8 times that number, and eventually he took Manchuria back from the nationalists, and before long, that party crumbled altogether. He then captured Beijing, Wuhan, and Guangzhou in 1949. By 1969, Biao was deeply ingrained in China's Cultural Revolution after rising the ranks of the Chinese Communist Party. It's largely thanks to Biao that Chairman Mao became an iconic figure in China, especially among the Red Guards, since he composed most of Mao's speeches and other writings. Since Biao was highly regarded in the military, he used his position to his advantage and suggested that China's constitution be amended. Thanks to this, he was named as Mao's successor, but it also likely led to his demise. Unbeknownst to him, Mao had started considering him a threat, and he decided it was time to get rid of Biao. Thanks to Chinese Communist Party propaganda, he was labeled a traitor to the revolution. According to official records, Biao decided to flee to the Soviet Union, and to do so, he boarded a plane on the 13th of September, 1981. But as the plane flew over Mongolia, it crashed into a field and everyone on board lost their lives. In the aftermath, it was claimed that Biao had been planning to assassinate Mao, but many people believe that it was he who was executed and that the plane was intentionally brought down. It's also been suggested he was never aboard the plane, but that he was executed in China, and the plane crash was used as an explanation for his sudden disappearance. Number 7. The Great Devon Mystery, also known as the Mystery of the Devil's Footprints, has remained an unsolved mystery since its occurrence in 1855 in England. At the time, the area was experiencing unusually cold weather and snowfall, causing rivers in the area to freeze over. On the 8th of February that year, Devon experienced heavy snowfall, rain, and a strong wind that blew in from the east. This weather prevailed through the night, and the following morning, people started reporting something very unusual that they could not explain, but which caused them a great deal of concern. They'd come across footprints in the snow that on any other occasion may have been attributed to a large dog or a wolf, if it weren't for the fact that they were found on rooftops, narrow walls, gardens that were protected by high walls, and other inaccessible areas. Furthermore, the print seems to indicate that whatever creature had made them only had 2 legs instead of 4, as the prints led away in a single line. The villagers followed the prints and soon discovered that they'd also been seen in areas as far as 100 miles away on the same night. Almost immediately, superstition took over, and people started spreading a rumor that the devil was at work in Devon. Residents of the village of Dawlish reported that they followed the prints along the coast and that they eventually disappeared into the sea without explanation. In Exeter, a group of men, determined to find the creature, discovered a set of tracks and they followed them into a barn. They were certain that they had cornered the beast and that they would be able to put a stop to it, but the prints led them to a brick wall where they suddenly stopped, as if the creatures had simply walked straight through it. Church leaders only added fuel to the fire when they declared the prints to be the work of Satan, and this only exacerbated the situation as superstitions ran rife. Naturalist Dr. Edward Forbes traveled to the area to find a rational explanation, but he was unable to link the tracks to any known animal, and he concluded that they couldn't possibly have been made by a normal animal. Those with cooler heads suggested that the markings had been made in the snow by a meteorological event, or that a group of pranksters was trying to cause panic in Devon, but this did little to bring calm among the superstitious. One night, while locals were having a drink in a tavern, a local woman named Eliza Montague claimed she had seen the beast responsible for the prints when she was still a child. She claimed that she was walking home through the woods when she spotted a tall man in the distance, but she noticed there was something strange about his appearance. His cloak billowed behind him, but she noticed there was no breeze to be felt. As he approached her, she noticed that he had red glowing eyes and that he had hooves instead of human feet. She ran for her life, and thankfully the man didn't follow. When she turned around, he'd simply disappeared as if into thin air. In the days that followed, the prints would appear over and over again, and in desperation, a group of men followed them into the woods one night. They later stated that as they entered the woods, it suddenly got colder, and they noticed a strange aura of foreboding. They followed the prints to a clearing where they found a strange stone in the center, of which the prints suddenly stopped. The ground in the circle was warm to the touch, and suddenly a growl emerged from the soil, along with a strange trembling. They turned to run, but before they could, a tall, thin man stepped out from behind the trees, and they noticed that his eyes were glowing red. His cloven hooves were clearly visible, and he pointed at them, warning them to leave and never return. They reported that they fled for their lives and did return the following day, but the prints were gone, and they never appeared again, leaving the case of the devil's footprints an unexplained mystery. Number 6. Thanks to an unfortunate accident that befell him in 1848, 25-year-old Phineas Gage has been hailed by many as the man who introduced the world to neuroscience, though he'll likely have gladly traded that title for a more normal life following the incident. At the time, Gage was working in Cavendish, Vermont, where he was employed as a railway worker, and he was in the process of clearing the way for new tracks to be laid. To do this, he used explosives to disintegrate the rocks that needed to be removed. He would drill a hole in each rock before packing it with an explosive charge with the use of a tamping iron, which is a 13-pound metal bar. There was nothing unusual about his technique, but on this day, the 13th of September, it resulted in a series of events that would change his life forever. While tamping down the explosives into one specific rock, the metal bar struck the side and caused a spark. This set the charge off prematurely, and the resulting explosion caused the metal bars to strike Gage in the face. His injury was horrific as the bar punctured his face beneath his eye socket before emerging at the top of his head. But miraculously, he survived. As is to be expected, the bar caused a massive amount of damage to his brain, specifically the frontal lobe. Despite this, he remained conscious and was able to walk unassisted to a cart while still talking to his fellow workers. He was loaded onto the cart and taken into town, where he was treated by a doctor. He remained conscious throughout and responded well to the doctor's questions, but he clearly had no idea how bad his injury really was, since he refused visits from his coworkers, stating that he would see them at work in a day or two. As was often the case with injuries back then, he developed an infection and slipped into a shallow coma, but he was able to get out of bed after waking up on the 7th of October, and his road to recovery had begun. A month later, he had recovered enough to leave his house, and he traveled to his parents' house in New Hampshire to recover fully. He returned the following year, and when he visited his doctor again, he'd lost vision in one eye, but seemed to have no other lingering effects from the accident. But this changed in the months that followed. Whereas Gage was a hard-working and friendly man before the incident, his personality started to change dramatically after his return. He was unable to hold down a job thanks to his unruly and aggressive nature, and he'd started drinking heavily. He'd use foul language without provocation, showed no patience towards anyone, including his friends, and was unable to stick to a plan once he had made it. This only caused him to become more irritable and belligerent. He told his doctor that he no longer was the same man, and he eventually decided to relocate to Santa Clara County, where he started working on a farm. There, he started suffering from seizures and would pass away on the 23rd of May, 1860. Number 5. As science has advanced throughout the years, we've become aware of many types of allergies that are caused by ingredients in our food. Some people avoid dairy products since they're lactose intolerant, or carry an EpiPen in case they accidentally ingest peanuts that can cause their airways to close. But in one very strange case that took place in Massachusetts in 2020, a 37-year-old woman whose name has not been made public started acting strangely, and naturally it was discovered that it was because she was sensitive to gluten. At the time, the woman was studying for her PhD when she started suffering from strange hallucinations. She started believing that everyone around her was out to get her in one way or the other, and that the loved ones in her life were not being sincere towards her, but were rather acting out a script in which she was the protagonist. Within just a few days, her paranoia had gotten out of hand, and her personality started to change. She had started shoplifting, something that she would normally never dream of doing, and would start arguments with strangers for no reason. Her parents decided to take her to a psychiatric hospital where she was examined and diagnosed with a psychotic disorder, and she was prescribed antipsychotic medication, but it had no effect. A second visit to the hospital revealed that she was suffering from mineral and vitamin deficiency. She'd lost a lot of weight, and at last it was discovered that she was suffering from celiac disease. The disease has strange side effects that cause a person's immune system to attack their own tissues whenever gluten is ingested, and hence she was told to switch to a gluten-free diet. But her delusions had gotten so bad, she believed the doctors were part of the conspiracy against her, and she continued with her normal diet. As a result, her condition only worsened, and before long she lost her job and her house, and started refusing to speak to her family. She was eventually returned to the hospital and was convinced to follow the doctor's advice. Just 3 months later, she was back to normal and thanked the hospital staff for being patient with her. But on one occasion, she accidentally ingested gluten, and as a result, attempted to end the lives of both of her parents. She was arrested, put on trial, and eventually found guilty of attempted murder. According to her doctor, she never contacted the hospital again, and it isn't known whether she made a full recovery. But her strange case has helped doctors better understand the effects that gluten can have on someone who's gluten sensitive, though these studies are still in their infancy. Number 4. When someone goes missing and is eventually found, they usually have quite the tale to tell. Some people simply get lost while hiking in the woods or become confused while traveling in an unfamiliar area. But in some cases, the details are more disturbing, as they reveal that they've been kidnapped or have no memory of the time that they were gone. The case of the disappearance of 18-year-old Elizabeth Canning is one such case in which many questions remain unanswered. Elizabeth was born in London in 1734, and she left school when she was 15, choosing to start work as a maidservant instead. By the time that she was an adult, her father had passed away, and she, along with her mother and siblings, moved to a house at Aldermanbury. She eventually moved out and started living in a room in her employer, Edward Lyon's house. On the 1st of January, 1753, she left the house to visit her uncle, and when she failed to return that night, Lyon went to her mother's house to look for her, but she wasn't there. Her uncle stated that he and his wife last saw Elizabeth when they parted ways at the Aldgate Church at around 9:30 that night. Her mother placed notes all over the city asking for information on her whereabouts, but for the next few weeks, no further clues were found. A 2-guinea reward was offered to anyone who came forward with useful information, but this never happened. Then, on the 29th of January, she suddenly walked back into her mother's house. She was in bad condition, as her hands were blackened with dirt. She was dressed in only her shift, petticoat, and bedgown. And around her head she had a rag that was covered in biological material. She told her mother that on the day that she disappeared, she was walking home when she was attacked by 2 men in Moorfields. They took all the money she had on her, as well as her dress, apron, and hat, before gagging her with a handkerchief and tying her hands behind her back. She was then struck in the head, which resulted in a seizure, and she lost consciousness. When she woke up, she walked to a house owned by someone with the last name Wills or Wells, and there, a woman tried to convince her to become a street worker. When she refused, the woman became outraged and forced Elizabeth into an upstairs loft. She was not allowed to leave, and for almost a month she was kept captive and given just water and scraps of bread to eat. One day, she managed to remove some boards that had been put over a window, and she escaped. She ran 5 miles back to her mother's house, and when the incident was reported to the police, it was found that the house belonged to Susanna Wells, who was also known as Mother. When the house was searched, Elizabeth identified the woman who'd held her captive, and she was arrested, along with Mary Squires, who was also living in the building. Wells stated that she had never seen Elizabeth before, but another resident of the house, Virtue Hall, confirmed that Wells and Squires had taken her captive. But then the case took a strange turn. Hall suddenly did an about-turn and recanted her statement against the 2 women, and she was then arrested for having committed perjury. Wells and Squires were both found guilty, but many people remained skeptical about Elizabeth's claims. After further questioning, Elizabeth was then arrested for providing false testimony, and Squires was released, though Wells had to serve her entire sentence before being released. Elizabeth was found guilty of willful and corrupt perjury. She spent a month in prison and then relocated to New England, where she married and eventually passed away in 1773. To this day, no one knows what really happened to Elizabeth or where she was for that month that she went missing. Number 3. One wouldn't consider England to be an area where large cats like panthers walk around freely, but these creatures have been spotted there more often than expected. While some of these reports have been debunked, several remain unexplained, including the case of the Beast of Citinum in a suburb of London, England, where 36-year-old Tony Holder was living in 2005. It's normally a rather quiet area, but one afternoon at around 2:15 p.m., Tony went into his garden to look for his tabby cat. As he walked around the side of his house, he was shocked to find that his cat was being pinned down by a huge Black Panther-like animal that he estimated was at least 5 feet long. He immediately shouted at it, and upon noticing him, it let go of the cat and set its sights on Tony instead. It leaped at him in a single bound and hit him in the chest and knocked him to the ground. It sat on his chest looking down at him, and Tony stated that he could see the whites of its eyes and massive teeth just a few inches away from his face. He was terrified, but only got more scared when the creature started snarling at him, and Tony believed he was about to lose his life in the most improbable of ways. He squirmed and pushed at the huge cat, but it outweighed him, and he found that he was unable to move. He had visions of his family finding him deceased after being mauled by the animal, but he tried to keep calm nonetheless. His 11-year-old daughter would later reveal that she saw the entire incident from her bedroom window, though she didn't know what it was that had knocked him to the ground, after which it made a hasty retreat. He called for an ambulance and was treated for scratches at the scene, but then something unbelievable happened. While paramedics were tending to his injuries, the same cat walked by the scene again as if nothing had happened. The police were called, and they raced to the scene, but when they arrived, the beast had disappeared once more. The area was sealed off, and investigators started a search, armed with tranquilizers and flashlights. They were unable to locate it, but shortly after, a man named Billy Rich contacted the police to report that he'd spotted it while looking out of his window at 5 a.m. He stated that it leapt across the road in front of his house and then headed towards Mayow Park. He described it as similar to a panther and dismissed suggestions that it may have been a fox or a Doberman. Number 2. Most people who are familiar with the case of the murder of Thomas Edwin Bartlett in London in 1886 believe that his wife Adelaide was responsible, but it's never been proven, and it remains a mystery to this day. Adelaide was born in Orleans, France in 1855, but at some point during her childhood, she was sent to Kingston upon Thames in England, where she lived with her aunt and uncle. In 1875, she met a grocer called Edwin Bartlett, and they fell in love, eventually deciding to get married. Bartlett believed that Adelaide needed further education, and so he sent her to a boarding school to, quote, fill in the gaps, as he put it. Hence, they only saw each other during holiday periods, and only in 1877 did she return to their apartment, which was located above his grocery store in Herne Hill. But after Adelaide suffered a miscarriage, she lost all interest in having children, and the couple's relationship started to deteriorate. Adelaide started having affairs with several men, placing further strain on our marriage, and when Thomas's mother passed away, his father moved in with them. He started accusing Adelaide of having an affair with Thomas's brother, Frederick, but Thomas would have none of it and forced his father to recant his statement in front of a solicitor. Meanwhile, Thomas was struggling with health issues that stemmed from a visit to the dentist, during which his teeth were filed down instead of being extracted for reasons unknown. The couple met a minister named George Dyson in 1885, and they became close friends. He'd visit them at their residence often, and Thomas hired him to further Adelaide's education in Latin, geography, and history. The couple then moved to Pimlico, but ensured that Dyson could still visit by purchasing a season ticket that he could use to travel between Putney and Waterloo. On one occasion, a woman working for the couple's landlord walked into the room while Dyson and Adelaide were busy with a lesson, and she was shocked to see she was lying with her head on his knee. It would later come to light that the three agreed that in the event of Thomas's passing, she was to marry Dyson. In December of that year, Thomas was diagnosed with gastritis, but Adelaide asked for a second opinion out of fear that she'd be accused of poisoning her husband. A second doctor agreed with the initial diagnosis, and Thomas soon started recovering while Adelaide looked after him. On the 27th of December, 1885, Adelaide asked Dyson to buy some chloroform that she claimed was to be used to ease the pain caused by his rotting teeth. Dyson went to 2 separate chemists, acquired the chloroform, and then on the 29th of December, he handed 4 ounces of the chemical to Adelaide. Thomas had dental surgery on the 31st of December that year, and when it was completed, he was returned home with his wife. Adelaide had started sleeping at the foot of their bed to avoid Thomas's bad breath, and when she woke up later that night, she discovered he was no longer alive. She called their landlord and stated she tried to revive Thomas with brandy, but to no avail. When an autopsy was performed, the case took a sinister turn. It was discovered that Thomas had large amounts of chloroform in his stomach, despite there being no signs that he had swallowed it, since his mouth and throat were clear. Adelaide was arrested and charged with Thomas's murder. Dyson admitted to purchasing the chloroform, and he was charged as an accessory before the fact. Her trial, which took place the following year, captivated the country, and the courtroom overflowed with onlookers while dozens of people droned around outside the building. It was determined that Dyson would serve well as a witness against Adelaide, and so the charges against him were dropped. The defense argued that since there were no chemical burns on Thomas's throat, Adelaide couldn't possibly have forced him to ingest the chloroform, and she was found not guilty. Adelaide moved back to France, and Dyson was kicked out of the church as his relationship with a married woman had been exposed. Thomas's demise is a mystery that still baffles experts today, and we'll likely never know what truly transpired that night. Number 1. At around 12:30 p.m. on the 23rd of April, 1960, a man named Edwin Smith was on his way home to his residence in Milwaukee. He was driving along North Plankington Avenue when he reached an area between Clybourne and St. Paul Avenues, where he heard something that chilled him to the bone. Over the drone of the car's engine, he could hear a woman screaming for help, and he immediately stopped to investigate. As he got out of the car, he realized that the screams were coming from a nearby alley, and he rushed over. There, he found 76-year-old Ida Lowry lying on the ground. She'd been badly assaulted, and when he tried to help her to her feet, she started screaming in pain. He decided to leave her there while he called the police, and after their arrival, she was taken to a hospital, but unfortunately she passed away from her injuries. The crime took the city by storm, as it was one of the most brutal in its history. Ida had been found walking along the street when she was pulled into an alley by an unknown man who assaulted her before fleeing. She described him as a big Caucasian man who she knew was employed at the bridge. She stated that she remained in the alley for about 15 minutes before her screams were heard by Smith, but couldn't remember much else. The alley was processed for clues, but none were found. Searches for the man were conducted, but since her description of him was vague, no suspects were identified. It was then discovered that Ida had become rather eccentric after her husband passed away in 1950, and that she was living in the Hotel Royale at the time that the attack took place. She was known to frequent alleyways where she would pick through trash cans looking for clothing and other items despite not needing them. Her only remaining family, her 2 sisters, had not seen her for weeks, and an elevator operator at the hotel reported that she left the building at about 10 p.m. that night, which was not unusual. A man who fit Ida's description of the attacker was questioned, as he was known to be a drunkard who had one stage worked at a railroad bridge, and when his apartment was searched, a set of clothes covered in biological material was found. When tests proved that the clothes didn't belong to Ida, he was no longer considered a suspect. When one of Ida's safety deposit boxes was checked, it was found to contain over $17,000 in cash, and no one could understand why she had constantly struggled to pay her $10 per week rent. One man stated that he may have attacked Ida while he was intoxicated, since he was prone to alcohol-induced amnesia, but his clothing also eliminated him as a suspect. Several other people were questioned, but no further suspects were ever named, and Ida's murder remains unsolved. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.